Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Allison to the channel. And we also have Napar Shadar, who's going to be doing today's interview. So over to you, Napar.
Thank you very much, Esoteric. I actually, for some reason, right before I got, okay, here we are. Couldn't see anyone. Hello, everyone. Hello, Dr. Allison. I'm very, very honored to sit with you because I've been, I'm going to be honest, I didn't know a lot about your work before Esoteric mentioned you to me, excuse me. And then I was very pleasantly impressed about your views on Jesus. I am a Christian in the sense that I do believe in the Messiah of the New Testament. So you are Professor Dale Allison is the head of the Department of New Testament Studies at, am I correct, Princeton Theological
Seminary. So I'm not head of the department. I have a chair in the department. I would never serve as the head of a committee or a group. So
you would never. Do you mind if I ask you why you wouldn't be interested in that?
Oh, because I'm a writer and I want to spend as much time at my desk as possible, and everything else is a sort of sideline that takes me away from my first love and what I think I'm good at. So I teach in order to write. That is, my books are not best-selling, so I can't just retire from everything else and write books. I have to make a living, and so I do that by teaching. But when I'm not in the classroom, I enjoy teaching, but when I'm not in the classroom, I want to be writing or reading and nothing else. So I'm a bit of a curmudgeon when it comes to other things.
Okay. So yes, you are a writer, and you are you have several books that you've authored. I did hear a little bit of an interview, not a little, a lot of an interview that you talked about. I mean, when you talked about your life, your early life as a young man, your journey. When you say you're writing, are you first? Is it first that you're a Christian, or first that you're a writer?
I think it's first that I was a writer. So I wanted to be a novelist when I was in 7th grade. I mean, that's what I wanted to do. I started my first novel when I was probably 11 years old or 12 years old. And then I didn't really become a church guy or simply possessed, I guess, with trying to understand the New Testament and the Christian tradition until a few years later. So the writer business actually comes first.
Right, the writer comes first. That's how you work your I guess faith out through your penmanship, or through your writing.
Yes. So I don't know how other authors work, but when I'm writing a book, I don't know how it's going to end or where it's going to go before I'm done with it. So it's like some novelists who say they start a novel, but the characters take over and they don't know where the novel is going, right? Well, that's the same thing that happens to me with a book. I don't know where it's going, and writing is how I think. So sitting in a chair and thinking isn't good enough for me. I have to actually, I'm not smart enough to do that. I have to actually sit down and write everything before I say, oh yeah, that is what I think, now that I've gone through all the motions and had to defend myself sort of publicly on paper. So it's a way of coming to conclusions for me.
Interesting, because I did hear you say once about your writing. You said, I'm so sorry about that. You said, that's my fault. Oops. You said that you write a book and then you leave it alone.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So I can see that from you. What now that you tell me, it's more for you, even though the book is for us. It's something cathartic for you, correct?
Yes. So I'm just really lucky. So I sit there and I write and I come to my conclusions, and there are other people who want to look over my shoulder and see what I did. So that's how I look at it. So so far anyway, there's always been an audience for a book that I've published, people who are interested in the same questions and the same issues.
Right. And speaking of questions and issues and topics, let's just dive right in and talk about
Okay.
Jesus. And especially a lot of your writings are about the resurrection. That's where I'm drawn. I'm drawn to that. And I also am very much interested in talking to you about your book, Night Comes. So let me start out with the questions that I have for you about this person, Jesus. Again, I believe in the New Testament, but many people don't. So can we really trust? I'm just going to play devil's advocate. If I was an atheist or someone who looks at the Gospels, can I trust that they are truly written by those who it says they're written by?
Okay, so you mean were they written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so my answer to that is yes and no. Okay, so I take these on an individual basis. So for me, it's not, are all four written by the names that appear in modern Bibles? The question is, did Matthew, a follower of Jesus, a disciple, one of the 12, write Matthew? Did Mark, who appears in the book of Acts, write that? Did Luke write Luke Acts, a figure who's in Paul's letters? Did John, the son of Zebedee, write John? So here, I guess the easiest thing is just to go through them one by one and tell you how I think about this. So when I say yes and no, I have spent a lot of time working on the Gospel of Matthew, and I don't think it was written by Matthew. I don't know who wrote it, but it doesn't make an eyewitness claim inside itself. And I think it's using the Gospel of Mark to a great degree, which seems unusual for me, not impossible, but unusual. If you're an eyewitness, you might be using your own memories. So there are additional reasons for doubting this tradition. On the other hand, I'm not sure it's completely without a basis. So I don't know how much your listeners know about modern biblical scholarship, but it's very common to look at the book of Isaiah and to say, well, the book of Isaiah actually falls into three parts. That is, there's the first part, which goes up through chapter 39. There's the second part that goes up through 40 to 55. And then there's a final section. So they call it, Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, and so on. But the first part of the book does have oracles from the prophet Isaiah, all right? But it appears that people later on added to those oracles. But the name of the book isn't Isaiah and Company or lots of different people. The name of the book is still Isaiah. And if I had to guess, this is a guess, but my guess would be that Matthew the apostle was associated with some source that lies behind the Gospel of Matthew, and that as it was added to and so on, it retained that name. So that's a guess as to where that comes from, although it's just a guess. As for Mark, the tradition about Mark is that it was written by a companion of Paul and Peter. And I think this tradition has a decent chance of being true, okay? But even if it is true, you still have to ask critical questions, because you have to ask, well, if the author of Mark has heard Peter, if he's heard Peter, how much of Mark is from Peter? And he doesn't give you any guidance about that. And if he's heard Peter, I'm sure he's heard from lots of other people and those other traditions and so on. And you'd also have to ask, well, was his only agenda just to remember? You'd have to ask about Peter. Was his only agenda to remember? So you can't get around the critical questions just by determining authorship. But so for Matthew, yes, no. For Mark, yes. I'm pretty confident the tradition is right about Luke. And my reason for saying that is that the guy who wrote Luke also wrote Acts. And in Acts, you have these passages where you go from the third person to first person. They're called the we passages. And in the last half of Acts, you get several of these, and it's very strange. And I think the best explanation is not that the author is stealing someone's journal. I think the best explanation is that the author was himself involved in these events, and that reduces to very few people, and Luke is one of them. So I think the tradition is probably right here. I'm fairly confident about that. So that's what? That's a no, a probable, highly probable, and then John. I'm one who thinks that the tradition is right, that the beloved disciple is the Apostle John. However, I don't think he wrote the book. I think if you read it all, you come away with the impression that he's dead. So I think in terms of a school of John or disciples of John or somebody who had heard him. So I think that the gospel is in part dependent on traditions that go back to the guy whose name is attached to it, but I don't think the book itself was written by him. So that's a very messy answer, but that's often what happens when you do history, right? So it's 2 no's and 2 yeses from me.
Well, you did a great job considering that there are tons and tons of debates about who has written the gospel. So I can relate to what you're saying. Now, just asking you a little bit more about, speaking of debates and conversations, the genealogy of Jesus in the book of Luke, and then in the book of Matthew, concerning the parents, the contradictions, the way there's, that's a common conversation or debate. Is that everything that you just mentioned? Could I look at that now and say, oh, well, that's why, because there could be more than one author? Talk to us about that.
Okay, so there are significant differences between these 2 genealogies, and the differences have bothered Christians going back to the 2nd century. So almost as soon as these texts appear, people read them and say, what the heck is going on? Now, first of all, I have to say that I wear 2 hats. One is the hat of the historian, and the other is the hat of the theologian. And I try my best to put the historian, to play historian first, and then to deal with the facts that I've discovered later as a theologian. So I have no way of harmonizing these 2 genealogies. I simply don't know how to do it. Now, the tradition has often said, well, Matthew's genealogy is Joseph's genealogy, and the one in Luke is Mary's. But I think if you just had Luke and you read it, you wouldn't think this is Mary's genealogy. I think you would think it's Joseph's genealogy. Now, when I look at Matthew, what I think I can say is that the first 2/3 of it look like they've sort of been built out of the Old Testament. You can get all that material from Old Testament genealogies, but the last third of the list, none of those names are people in the Hebrew Bible. I don't know where they came from. I don't know where the author got it. I simply don't know, as an historian, anything about it. It's just a list of names, and we know nothing about these people. When you get to Luke, I simply don't know what it is. That is, I don't know his sources. I don't know what he's doing. I don't know to what extent the family of Jesus had a genealogy. So sometimes it's very frustrating. Sometimes when you're a historian, you simply have to say, well, I don't know where these come from, and I don't see how they go together. All right. I should also say that although I'm a Christian, I'm not somebody who believes in inerrancy. I'm also somebody who, in some ways, I suppose is a modern liberal Christian. So it's okay for me to say that maybe these genealogies can't be harmonized, and just to go on from there. However, I could add to that even if I don't know historically that these are the right names, if you will, they're still interesting. So Matthew goes back to Abraham, Luke goes back to Adam. Those are really interesting facts about what the authors might be trying to say. And again, in Matthew's genealogy, in the middle of all these men, there are 4 women. And you have to ask, why mention 4? Because there were women in each case, right? So why just name these? And so that leads to the question, what do they have in common? Did Matthew think they were Gentiles? And he was trying to show that there are Gentiles in the genealogy. Were all these women associated with scandal in some form so that they sort of prefigure Mary? Anyway, so the historical question, I'm just saying, isn't the only question you can ask about these genealogies. And Matthew's genealogy at points may be almost preachable, although I think I've only heard it done once in church. Most people just stay away from these. But I think that they are literarily and theologically interesting, even if as an historian, I can't tell you where the sources for this were. And I have no way to gauge their accuracy or inaccuracy.
Wow, thank you. Yes, so the conversations continue, which, you know, I like how you pointed out about the women. I did notice that as well. They are Gentiles, Rahab and how Ruth. And so, yes, I did pick up on that as well. So thank you. I want to ask you, speaking of, let's keep talking about the genealogy and let's talk about his father, Jesus's father, Joseph. I want to hear from you as a theologian, as an author who this is your expertise. Talk to us why Joseph, the father, is very spoken of ambiguously or barely at all in the Gospels. Why is that?
Okay, so look, the sources don't tell you. So what you have to do is make your best guess. Now, Mary is there. Mary's actually in the book of Acts. There are lots of traditions about her. She shows up in the Gospels. My guess is simply that Joseph died when Jesus was young. That would explain why he's not there, he's not around, and so on. Now, I'll add to that some speculation, if you'll indulge me. And this is the kind of thing that is speculation. But I teach theology students, and when we talk about the doctrine of God, it's obvious that people who grew up with wonderful fathers, with wonderful dads, don't have any problem thinking of God the Father as loving them. But I have had students whose fathers abused them, right? And it was sort of counterintuitive to associate the God figure, right, with this horrible person that, you know, messed their lives up. I wonder if you look at what Jesus has to say about God as Father, and he uses that appellation a lot, Father. I don't think he had a bad relationship with his dad. Okay, again, we're just doing amateur psychology here, nothing but speculation. But if his dad died young, it would perhaps be easier to idealize him and to be comfortable with the figure of the father as the loving figure. You know, the longer you're with people, the more faults you see. It's just inevitable, right? When you first fall in love and you know date, it's all wonderful. But after 40 years, you know the faults of the other person. Maybe Jesus knew dad for 5 years or 8 years, and then dad was gone, and he had a good memory of him, and maybe he had no bad memories at all. Now, again, that's pure psychology, and I don't know what a theologian would want to do with that. Maybe a theologian would want to run away. But aside from that, I would guess that that he's simply gone, and that's the best explanation. That's the best explanation.
Now, that wasn't your theologian answer. That was it?
No. That was my historian's answer plus historian speculation.
Okay,
No.
and I appreciate you're in the right place for speculation. We are all for speculation. Because, you know, at the end of the day, I say that and I want to ask you, I know this wasn't one of the main questions, but I really want to hear from you on this. I think that we conceptualize God from ourselves, but I still believe, I don't think that discounts the reality of God.
Uh-huh.
Can you speak to that for me?
Well, you always perceive the world through your own eyes, and there's no way to do anything else. And in fact, you can even get biological here. The scientists can talk about how the ant eyes see the world very differently than human eyes do, right? And it's also the case with experience. That is, people bring to whatever text they're reading or whatever idea they are engaging with their presuppositions. Pastors tell me frequently that after they preach a sermon and then they stand out in front of the church and shake hands and hear comments on the sermon, they often can't believe what they're hearing because people perceive things that, you know, really weren't there, or they read things that the pastor hadn't intended, but there really was a sermon, right? I mean, there was a sermon, everybody heard it, but they came away with different perceptions and so on. Also, the truth is that ordinary perception, if I understand the contemporary scientists, neuroscientists, and so on, is in some sense projection. We all work with this idea of a sort of naive realism, but the brain is always filling in gaps, and we're always projecting past experience onto present perception and so on. So I'm not sure that God is that different than everything else. That is, everything else is seen from a personal point of view, or from the point of view of the species, or from the point of view of your brain. But that doesn't mean there aren't things out there to be perceived, or that things do not affect you. So you're just stuck with it. You're an animal, right? You're a mammal, and you have a mammalian brain, and so you perceive the world through a mammalian brain. But that doesn't mean there is no world to be perceived.
Wow, that's great answer to my question. I would ask you about when you talk about we're animals. I've heard you say you dabble a bit into these. I'm gonna say quantum theory, quantum physics. I've heard you, right?
Well, so I think the important point there is that if you talk to somebody who is doing work with subatomic physics,
right,
they will say, if they're honest, I don't really have any conception of what these things are we are studying. I simply see some effects in bubble chambers, and we can write some equations, but I have no idea what these things are in themselves. In fact, they'll tell me, oh, they're not things. They are waves of probability. And then I just, what the heck is a wave of probability? It doesn't make any sense. So even there, when you're talking about the physical world around us, our mind runs into walls or limitations. There are things past which we can't think. And it's obvious when you take other species, you look at dogs or chimpanzees or cats, and you know that they can't figure out everything. You know that there are limits to what they can think, and it has to be the same with us, all right? It has to be the same with us. So I take the lesson from physics to mean that we don't know everything, and that we need to be very humble and cautious, and not be too vain in our pronouncements about the way things really are. I personally think the world is very strange, and that there are mysteries everywhere. And even though modern science is wonderful and has taught us much, I still think we're infants trying to figure things out.
Wow. And you know what, when you say that, it's like we give ourselves permission to know that we're not going to know everything, but we still love trying to figure things out, right?
Yes. So the way I sometimes put it is, God made our minds as well as our hearts, and wants us to use both of them, and not one at the expense of the other. And so it's actually a duty, I think, to think, to use your mind, to use what you have been given. And at least for many people, it seems intuitive just to ask questions. I mean, if you've ever been around little kids, they ask questions as soon as they talk, right? Why, what? It's just built into us. So yeah, I think it would. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying I'm agreeing with you. And when you've asked so many questions, and you sit down with your pen and your paper, and then you manifest this wonderful book that we can look into your conceptualization of things. And so, yeah, that's what I think.
I should also say that I teach at a seminary,
Mhm.
and I think that's a good thing. So what that means is that there are multiple teachers with multiple points of view. I'm not the only one here. That would be a disaster. So
Mhm.
you come to me and see the world through my eyes, but you can go to the class next door and see it through somebody else's eyes. And in that way, you can come to see it through your own eyes, being informed by what other people have to say.
That's beautiful. I love that statement. That's wonderful. And speaking of all of this, let's talk about the resurrection, and your concept of Jesus and the resurrection. Is it literal? Is it spiritual? Because, and before you go into it, I want you to be very conscious of the atheist or someone who will be like, this doesn't, he's confusing me. Wait, he said one thing. Because don't they often say, well, you're contradicting yourself? Don't you hear that often? And please answer that.
Okay, well, certainly atheists like to point at Christian doctrine and say that it's incoherent or Christians are contradicting themselves. But the main objection to the resurrection has always been that it's an astounding miracle. And we have a sort of automatic anti-miracle pose in much of the Western academy today. I don't share that. Again, as I said, I think the world is a really weird place, and I don't mean that as a throwaway statement. If you read some of the things I've written, you'll see that I really, really mean this. So my objection to the atheist is that atheist needs to be more open-minded about certain things, okay? But this is going to the question of what should we think about the resurrection? Is that what you want?
Well, I want you to, as you many times have done, talk to our audience about, although you are a Christian, your belief in the resurrection as far as the material, like the flesh. Was it a literal person who came back to life? So talk to our audience about that.
Okay, so look, I don't want to be pretentious here, by which I mean I don't want to pretend I have answers. So I have written a lot on this subject over the years, and the reason I keep coming back to it is I find it confusing. All right. So as an historian, I think the best explanation of the data is that Jesus's tomb was found unoccupied shortly after he was buried. And I think if the atheists were smart, the atheists would say, okay, I think it was empty, but I'm going to gamble that it was maybe removed by tomb robbers or something like that, a secular explanation. So I think that the tomb was empty. I also think that the disciples had what I would call veridical visions. That is, they weren't just hallucinating or projecting. I think that they were somehow experiencing something that was there. However, if you try to conceptualize this, I think you're back with what the physicists are confused about. That is, if you say Jesus rose bodily, that's fine, okay. But then I don't think it's mischievous to ask, okay, well, what is a body? What is matter? I mean, this is my body. Is it waves of probability? Is it really not solid? Is it 99.99999 empty space as they tell me it is? Is it energy? Okay, so I just in general, I don't know what human beings are, as silly as that sounds. But then if you look at the resurrection accounts, they are weird. It's not just a guy getting up and saying hello and shaking people's hands. He pops in out of nowhere. How does that work? Okay, I have no idea how that works. It's like he's popping in from the dimension next door. And then it looks like, oh, he's popping out again, right? And if you look at Matthew's account, it's very interesting. They bury Jesus, they put the stone in place, and then people show up, and then the stone is opened, it's moved, and they go in and he's not there. Well, what that means is that he's either walked through the rock or he just popped out into some other place. That's really what I think the text implies. And so my point is, or one of my points is, I just don't know how to conceptualize this sort of weird thing. So there is a well-known New Testament scholar named N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, who has used the term transphysicality. Okay, well, I've endorsed that, but I'm still not sure what the heck I mean by it, right? And then I have this other problem. So I am somebody who thinks that when I die, I will not go out of existence. I think that I will still be myself in significant ways, all right? And I think this is true while my body is, underground. While my body is still there. I don't believe in what's called soul sleep. I don't think when you're dead, and then you come back to life at the end of time. So the point is, you can survive death. You can, I hope, be victorious over death, even if your body is in the grave. So theologically, again, I don't know how to put all the pieces together. I think the tomb was empty. I think the disciples saw Jesus. I think Jesus saw them. But then how to conceptualize this just leaves me in a mess. And by the way, Christian theologians have debated this over the centuries. So John Calvin appears to have believed that when Jesus ascended, he actually went to some place in outer space. That does appear to be what he thought. Whereas, if I understand Martin Luther seems to think that when Jesus ascended, he sort of sloughed off his body because he didn't need it anymore, because Jesus is like God. He's a ubiquitous spirit. Jesus is in the Eucharist. Jesus is in your heart. Jesus isn't a body located over there at, in heaven, 6th and Elm Street, walking down streets of gold. That's not how it works. So I'm not sure I can go any further here because again, my mammalian mind just says, okay, I can sort of do the bubble chamber equations. I can say, well, tomb was empty, he saw them, and so on. But how to put it together so that I can conceptualize the thing in itself, that's a mystery to me. And by the way, I like Paul at the end of 1 Corinthians 15, which is his longest discourse on the resurrection. He at the end uses the word mystery. Right? It's a mystery. Okay, so I want to expand that and say, okay, not only is his immediate subject right there a mystery, but all sorts of other things are mysterious to me. I can say certain things, but they're always circumscribed.
Right. And you know what? I appreciate that your honesty, being very candid about that. It doesn't take away from your expertise or you as a theologian. It actually makes you more credible, and people, I think, would want to listen to you more because you're like, I'm still working this out. So, but I do want to mention too about Paul, where he says, right now we see through a glass darkly. So that's that concept too, right? Like, we don't know, will we ever know until...
Oh, well, so I think my own theological take or speculation goes back to a wonderful 4th century bishop named Gregory of Nyssa. And what he said is that God is infinite. God is truly infinite. And that means you can never comprehend God. All you can do is move into infinity, or the way he spoke about it was you could always move up the mountain, but the mountain is infinite. So you never get to the top, but you can get closer to the top, so to speak. All right. So I guess ultimately, I think this life must in part be about education, be about learning. And I'm one who thinks that the life to come will probably be more of the same. I don't really want to leave this life and then just go on a vacation of an infinite duration or sit on a cloud for infinity. And again, since God is infinite, I expect an infinity of exploration of the infinite.
Wow. Speaking of that, I mentioned that you have your book Night Comes, because you talked about the afterlife. Now, you had an experience. If you could just, for our audience, briefly speak to us about your experience at 23. It wasn't necessarily an NDE. Well, you say it wasn't.
No, it was no, it wasn't. No, so it wasn't
Harmless.
what you call a near-death experience where you are unconscious on the operating table and you go to the ceiling and you see the light and you go down the tunnel and your life passes before you. Mine was actually a near-death experience in the old-fashioned sense of the term. That is, I came very close to dying, and the reason I talked about that in the book was to introduce the subject of fear of death, because I was very young and my whole life was ahead of me, and I thought I might not make it through the night. I actually was on a hospital. I was in the emergency room, and somebody came and gave me a pen and said, please sign this piece of paper. And it had something to do with, if you die right now, on the operating table, we're not liable, or some weird thing like that. Now, I was all messed up, so I don't have the facts right. But I remember signing a piece of paper, and I remember a doctor saying, son, you have a 50-50 chance of making it through this evening. And the utter terror, the horror that I had at that moment was, I've never had anything like it before or since. It was simply abject horror. And I did what everybody, I later learned, does in our society. I don't know if you know this, but the psychologists, social psychologists, have interviewed people in my situation. And what almost everybody does, including many atheists, is they make a deal with God. They say, okay, God, if you get me out of this, if you keep me alive, then I will do such and such, right? It's just natural. But the main point was that I was petrified then. And part of the purpose of the book is to show how I moved from being petrified to being less petrified now, much less petrified, I hope, if I were to be in that situation again, than I was then. But it certainly focused my thoughts. And I've thought a great deal about death since then.
When you say atheists do that bargaining with God, is it because we're faced with our mortality? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, statistics show us that, I can't remember off the top of my head, and it varies from North America to Great Britain and so on, but a significant percentage of atheists say they pray once a month.
Mm-hmm.
They just find themselves doing it, and they say, oh, I shouldn't be doing that. But it's just natural to look outside of yourself and to want help. So I think it's human, which is why people everywhere, all over the world, whatever culture it is, they pray to God or to the gods or whatever it is they think is outside themselves. I don't think there is a culture that doesn't have people within it that doesn't have some sort of prayer or petition to the powers beyond. It's just something we do as human beings. It's completely natural. It's like eating or breathing. It just happens.
You said you don't want to just sit on a cloud with you didn't say the harp, but I pictured a harp.
Yeah.
But what do you think about reincarnation and relating it to Christianity? There are some things in the Bible. I personally lean toward that. So what do you think about that?
Okay, so for me, and here I have theological friends who think that I'm making a mistake, but for me, this is an empirical question before it is a theological question, all right? So there are people who have case studies. So Ian Stevenson or Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia, not too far away from here, they have interviewed lots of children who reportedly can remember, their lives. And I have read this material, and I do find it puzzling I find it deeply puzzling. And the most straightforward explanation, I think, is that these children or some children have memories of other lives. All right. And it seems to me what the theologian should do is not just say, well, that's not the mainstream Christian tradition, and I can't find it in the Bible, so we have to attack it. I think the thing to do is look at the evidence, and if you can explain it away, fine. But if you can't, then you need to begin to think about it theologically and say, okay, if this is true, what do we do as Christians? I have not spent a lot of time theorizing this theologically, all right? I've gone out on enough limbs. I don't want to go out on that limb too, right? I've also discovered that people allow me to talk about certain unusual things, but that is one in certain circles that people just won't entertain, so it's just gone. I can't go there. But I will say that while, let's say, Jim Tucker has had his critics, if you read his 2 books, I think you have to say that if he's not lying, or if he is not somehow inadvertently cheating, and by the way, I have met him, I know people who know him, he's not cheating, all right? He's not cheating. Then there is a real phenomenon here to be explained. And it shouldn't be at the margin. It shouldn't be at the margin of serious intellectual discourse, which it still is, right? If the explanation is not reincarnation for some of these cases, it may be something just as weird or interesting.
Wow. Yes. I have seen those studies of the children, and I can't see that is. I mean, it looks authentic to me from what I've seen from my end. Now, let me to ask you a question and try to tie it into reincarnation somehow. It's about Jesus, and it's about the stories, the stories that predate Jesus, the story, the male sun god, and when I say sun, I mean S-O-N, the God, the son of God. We've got Tammuz, Bacchus, Horus. Those stories that predate Jesus, this story. How do you explain that, or how do you speak? Is it reincarnation? Are they coming back, or what do we do?
So no, I don't think reincarnation has anything to do with these stories. The figures you refer to, I would call mythological. All right.
Yes.
And so if you're looking at Tammuz is a fertility deity. And so the story follows the seasons, and you have fall, and then you have winter, which is death, where everything goes away and dies back. And then you have spring again. So that has nothing to do with an historical figure. That is just a way of thinking that you find all over the place. It's a way of mythologizing the cycle of nature, or the 4 seasons, right? Or the seasons, yeah. What does that have to do with Jesus? I would argue several things. One is I don't see any direct connections between any of these myths or stories and the resurrection's accounts in the gospel. So if you look at Bacchus, for example, Bacchus is cut into pieces, and then a woman eats his heart, and then she conceives, him again from that. Okay, I don't see that has anything to do with what you find in the Gospels, all right? So the idea that gods might die or go away and then come back, that's just worldwide mythology. That's just something, the kind of story that people tell. But this is always tied in with what is called the mythological view of Jesus. So there are people out there that don't think Jesus existed, that he wasn't an historical person, that he's a myth in the same way that Hercules was a myth or Zeus was a myth. And this goes back to the end of the 19th century. And we had a group of folks who showed up and said, you know, the skeptics haven't been skeptical enough, so let's just go all the way. The Gospels aren't part history and part myth. They're all myth. And the interesting thing is that was debated 1900, 1910, 1915. And by that time, the idea was gone. That is, it had been defeated in the academic arena. And it's almost impossible to come up with anybody who's an academic in the next 100 years or so who thinks Jesus didn't exist. There are always exceptions. But what's happened is, and I think it's the product of social media, right? And podcasts and blogs and things like that, that some atheists, recent atheists, have decided that this is the best way to go in combating Christianity, is to go back to this old idea that Jesus was mythological. But it doesn't have a serious take within the mainstream community. And among the reasons why people don't buy into it is the fact that we simply have these letters of Paul, and there is no reason to doubt there's a guy named Paul living in the middle of the 1st century who wrote at least some of these letters that are in his name. And he talks about Jesus as an historical figure who died in the recent past. He knows of his brothers. He quotes some sayings of his, and he knows he's descended from David. So Paul, although in his letters, he's not passing on traditions about Jesus and he's not dealing with memories of Jesus, he's just pulling up once in a while things he knows about Jesus. They establish, if you're not just skepticism run amok, if you're just looking for what's overwhelmingly likely, he's not a mythical figure. He's an historical figure. And so then the question becomes for the historian, not did he exist, but how do we evaluate the Gospels? How do we decide what he really said and what he didn't, what people might have added, what stories can we trust, and so on. But it's a question of sorting and evaluating, not dismissing the text that we have.
Dr. Allison, do you see Paul as, I mean, I know Peter is supposed to be I shouldn't say supposed to, in Christianity, he's the church father. But between Paul and Peter, would you say who established the church and worked? I really want to get you on.
Who established the church?
Let me say this on record for you. When you really stand back and look at it and you say, okay, I know what Paul's done. I know Peter, he was the right-hand man, one of the right-hand men of Jesus. But the work that Paul has done, is it just that he's the father of theology, or did he really do a lot of the footwork in establishing the Christian church? That's what I'm trying to get you.
Okay, so if you go back, I'll approach it this way. If you go back to the 2nd century, the 3rd century, there were people who were what we call Jewish Christians. That is, they were Christians who were born Jews, and they were circumcised and they were raised with Torah, and they continued to be Jews, right? Even though they were Christians, sort of like modern day Messianic Jews, okay? But that group of Christians dies out somewhere in the 4th and 5th century, and it's already a minority current in the 2nd century. The branch, if you will, of Christianity that succeeds and then conquers the Roman Empire is the Gentile Christian community. Now, Peter primarily, I think, was involved with Jewish Christians, and Paul was involved primarily with Gentile Christians. And given that it's the Gentile Christian branch of Christianity that exploded and did so well, and the other branch actually sort of withered and then died, I think you have to say that Paul, in some ways, is the more important of the two figures, and certainly is theologically, because even if you think Peter wrote, let's say, First Peter is not the foundation of much Christian thought in the way that people appeal to Romans or to Galatians or go through First Corinthians. So Paul has left these letters, and he did travel all over the place. He founded communities. And so from one point of view, he seems to have been very successful. All right. So whether you like him or not, I think you have to say that he's a major figure on world history, because I think he is, I don't know, I'm not sure how to generalize this, not mostly responsible, but to a great extent, he is probably responsible for what came later. Whereas the Christianity in Jerusalem and in Israel and Palestine, it didn't catch on in the same way. And most Jews were never Christians. Most Jews were never Christians. Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, did not convert most Jews.
Okay, so we can say we have you on record saying that Paul is actually the father of Christianity.
Whoa, well, I wouldn't put it that way.
I agree with you.
Paul's very, very important. Paul's very, very important. But also, I think you have to suspect that the sources are a little one-sided. So whoever wrote Acts, Paul was one of his heroes. And then we have Paul's letters. I am sure that if we had some letters from Barnabas or knew more about some of these other folks, we could give them due credit. But we just don't have the stuff, right? So by default, Paul wins. But at the very least, he's a major influential person. I don't think that's a fiction of the book of Acts.
Right, and there's so much controversy. Well, I will say controversy with people who say, okay, did he write these epistles? Was this interpolated by, Sosthenes and things like that, right?
Well, so I don't know how to count heads, but I think it's safe to say that almost everybody within the guild thinks that Paul wrote Romans and First Corinthians and Second Corinthians and Galatians and Philippians, right? So there's a core within here, and then people debate Colossians. I think Paul had a hand in the production of Colossians, but I have doubts that he wrote Ephesians, and I have doubts about First Timothy and Titus. Second Timothy just puzzles me. I don't know what to do with it. All right. So I think it's fair to say that, again, apart from some mythicists and some folks, the if you want to call it the mainstream scholarship, thinks that Paul wrote at least a number of these letters.
Okay, yes, wow. We have to take it piece by piece at the end of the day, right? Like there's so many different letters. How many letters to Timothy? 4?
Well, the 2 letters to Timothy and 1 to Titus. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And they're the so-called 3 pastoral letters. And lots of scholars are sure that Paul didn't write them.
Yeah.
Who would then have written them? And how do you explain them? One of the theories that I have off and on been attracted to, an old theory, is called the fragment theory. That is, somebody had some pieces of some short things that Paul had written or short correspondence, and then worked them up into larger things. I don't know. I haven't spent my life on Second Timothy. All I know is that it confuses me, because some of it sounds like Paul to me, and other parts don't sound like Paul to me. So what do I do?
So you did early, say that last part, I'm sorry.
I just think some more, keep thinking.
Keep thinking, right? keep thinking and keep writing, please. We're looking forward to that. I want to ask you something you mentioned earlier. This will be my last question about Paul, but I had never heard that Paul wrote, possibly could have written Mark. That's what you said, Mark, correct?
No. I'm not sure what you were.
Maybe, yeah, I might be confused.
Yeah, I think you misheard me there, or maybe I misspoke. I'm not sure. I don't think I was talking about Mark at that point. Okay.
It's not, there's nothing out there saying that Paul had possibly written one of the Gospels.
No, there is not. However, the tradition holds, and as I said earlier, it could be right, that John Mark wrote John and that a guy named Luke wrote Luke. If those were true, then it would be the case that somebody who knew Paul wrote Luke, and somebody who wrote Mark also, somebody who wrote Luke knew Paul, and somebody who wrote Mark knew Paul. Now, then you could ask, well, if they've known Paul and if he's influential, has he influenced them in the way they think about Jesus? And some people say, okay, there's a little bit of Paul in the Gospel of Mark, right?
Mhm.
Maybe they're right. Maybe they're right.
Well, I want to, you've spent an hour with us, and I want to say thank you. I have one more question.
Okay.
Because I, as a child, was always intrigued with the part of the Gospels that talk about Joseph of Arimathea. So I was so happy to hear you address Joseph of Arimathea, and I think it's because I was raised Catholic, and as a small child, when I heard Joseph, I was like, oh, there's his dad, I'm talking about childhood, right?
Yeah.
So, but as I got older, I was like, who was this man? He's really mysterious. I want to ask you, please go into any information you have about Joseph of Arimathea, and is there any extra biblical information validating his existence?
Okay, so there are extra biblical legends. So, for example, Joseph of Arimathea. You're in London, is that right? Are you?
I'm in America. I'm in the United States.
Oh, you're in America. Okay, Esoteric is over there in London. All right. So he's over there where Joseph of Arimathea supposedly was. So the legend is that Joseph of Arimathea took the cup, the Holy Grail from the Last Supper, and went over and founded the Church of England. Now, I don't believe that. I don't know any historians who believe that. Maybe some old Anglicans still think that's true. There are legends about him. But the sad fact is that there are no references to him outside of the Gospels. In fact, there's no reference to Arimathea. So it must have been a really tiny little hamlet on the highway with, just one gas station and two houses, okay? Because it's not in the record. Now, I have in more than one place argued that we have good reason to think that the burial is historical. The real question for me would be if it is, and if somebody named Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus, what were his motives? Maybe he was the guy just in charge from the Sanhedrin of burials, pauper burials or whatever. Maybe he did this for other people. Anyway, the problem is that we're dealing here with history, and this is one of those points where we just have to say it's just too bad. We don't have the biography. We don't have the autobiography. Paul says nothing about him. The rabbis say there's nothing else. Just what you have in the Gospels is it, and you can't do anything more than that. All right. The one thing I think we can infer is that if he was known as Joseph of Arimathea, he had probably just moved or recently moved. You wouldn't have that appellation if your family had been living there for 3 generations, right? So he probably hadn't lived in Jerusalem long, and it's occurred to me that might explain why you have the tradition of a new tomb. If he's just showed up and he's just bought a burial space, maybe nobody's in it yet because he's just started to carve it out. Speculation, don't know. So I'm very sorry we have to end with that as the last question, because I just have to frustrate you and say, as far as I know, nobody in the world knows. You'll just have to ask him when you see him. Who are you, Joseph?
One day. But there is information in there that let me, if you don't mind if I bounce this off of you. Personally, I've looked at him and I've said, well, he gave, I think spikenard and those were very valuable herbs or incense.
Yeah. Okay. So you're thinking of the Gospel of John, which gives to Jesus an incredible amount of aromatics and spices for his burial.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now you don't find that in Mark or Matthew or in Luke. You only find it in John. And what most commentaries say is that John is trying to say that Jesus received something like a kingly burial. You know, that you have this great amount of stuff. But you have to say, if you're an historian, that that's only in John, right? It's not in your earliest source, Mark, and it's not even in Matthew and Luke. So, yeah, that's all you can say, right? It's in one source at the end of the first century, and the historian's not going to be really excited with that. Okay, that's not anything the historian can work with.
So you're saying that could be a little bit of him elaborating or
yes.
adding? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I can wrap my mind around that. So thank you so much for spending time with us. I would love to have you back and talk to you. What are you working on your latest piece of work?
So I have a book that just came out with Erdman's called Encountering Mystery, Religious Experience in a Secular Age. And I'd be delighted to come on and talk to you all about that.
I'd love to have you back.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Dale Allison.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Thank you.